Thanks everyone for taking some time out of your day to hop on here. My name's Mark. I'm sure I probably met a few of you before, but for those that haven't, I currently run our security operations team here at WatchGuard. And today, we're just going to be taking a step back and chatting about the cyber threat landscape that's out there. We'll take a look at some of the data that the WatchGuard Threat Lab has been able to pull together from our customer devices that have opted into sharing it with us, as well as some third-party data as well too, and really paint a picture of what all the adversaries are doing out there, and then turn around and give you some advice on how to defend against it. So I welcome any and all questions along the way. I've got the GoToWebinar control panel up here, so if you want to type in any questions you have, I'll try and answer them as I go. Otherwise, we'll get to anything I missed at the end of the webinar. So with that, again, real quick about me, I've been at WatchGuard 10 years now and a few different roles and responsibilities, but my day-to-day now is leading both our internal security operations team, so the organization responsible for keeping WatchGuard itself secure, as well as our threat research team, so the WatchGuard Threat Lab. And on the Threat Lab side, that's the really fun stuff. Our whole job is just to keep our finger on the pulse of security and really paint a picture of what the threat landscape looks like that, and then turn it around into these webinars and blog posts and our podcast on secplicity.org, just to give you some education on what to watch out for. I come up from that red team side of things. I love vulnerability research. One of my big passion projects is going and buying whatever the latest network connected doodad is off of Amazon.com and trying to rip holes in it. Come from a lifetime of just ripping apart every electronics device I ever had growing up. Really ticked off my parents along the way there too, but it's kind of led me to where I am now on the defender side of things, on trying to keep adversaries out of WatchGuard's network. So enough about me though. Let's go over our agenda for today. We'll start with just an overview of the cyber threat landscape. So some of the key trends and statistics that we're seeing out there, targeting small and mid-sized organizations. Then we'll jump into the 3 top cyber threats that you need to watch out for. So specific trends and specific attack techniques and methods that the adversaries are using. And then once we've scared you, we'll pause and take a step back and talk about how to defend our networks against all these threats and trends that we're seeing. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on in with a quick overview of the threat landscape. And I've actually got a pop quiz for all of you. Through the quiz or the polling widget within GoToWebinar, what percentage of malware do you think evades signature-based detections out there? Do you think it's 5%, 25%, 33%, or 50%? And so as you're answering this, considering just basic anti-malware protections, the ones that are typically based off of identifying malware artifacts by a signature, the polling actually came back pretty dang accurate to the actual results. So around 50% of you said that the correct answer is 50%. And that's actually accurate. So if we look at the intelligence that we get from our Firebox appliances deployed throughout the world, one of the numbers that we track on a regular basis is what we call this 0-day malware number. And for the technical folks, this is different than a 0-day vulnerability, which is an exploit against a unpatched vulnerability. When we say 0-day malware, we're talking about malware that doesn't have a signature, meaning it gets past signature-based protections. Now, that could be because it's brand new, so something that signature-based detections just has never seen before. But more commonly, it's actually really old malware, potentially years old, that adversaries have just run through a program like a packer or a cryptor or some other obfuscation tool in order to make it evade signature-based detections. And so for the last month or so, this number has been right around 52%, meaning if you're just relying on signature-based detections, you're missing half of all the malware threats that are out there. And that sounds crazy, but that's actually on the low end. Typically, we see this number as high as like 75 to 80% or so. But the reality is, if you're just relying on basic protections for your networks and your endpoints, you're going to be missing half of the threats that pop through. And part of the reason for that is it's actually really easy for adversaries to carry out a malware-based attack without ever dropping malware on your endpoint at all. In fact, living off the land attacks, so attacks that attack techniques that abuse the tools built into our operating systems, have been skyrocketing over the past few years. One of the trends that we track in our quarterly security report is what percentage of malware, or what's the main infection origin for malware on an endpoint. So meaning like what's that initial technique or tool that it used to kick off the attack? And that percentage for the second quarter of this year was 87% for script-based threats. So scripts being something like PowerShell or a bash script on Mac or Linux. Even JavaScript these days can be used to kick off a malware attack on an endpoint. And again, these are abusing the scripting tools built into our operating systems. In fact, if we break that 87% number down, 99% of those threats originated with a PowerShell script specifically, because these are really strong and robust tools that enable us as administrators to do a lot of legitimate work on an endpoint. But in the hands of an adversary, they can use them in some built-in toolkits that we'll discuss later to carry out an entire malware attack, whether it be a remote access Trojan or ransomware or really anything, without ever dropping a malware file itself onto the hard drive on your computer. And this has enabled adversaries to lie in wait for quite some time. This is actually pop quiz time number 2 for all of you. And I want to know, how long do you think it takes on average for the average organization to identify that it's been the victim of a breach? Do you think it's 7 hours, 7 days, 7 weeks, or 7 months? So we're talking the MTTI, so the mean time to identify for a breach. Do you think it's relatively short, relatively long? So looks like around 42% of you think that the correct answer is 7 weeks. Second up behind there, 33% say 7 months. A bit fewer, 7 days. 6% say 7 hours. Well, if we take a look at the latest IBM cost of a breach report that they put out every single year in partnership with the Ponemon Institute, we can actually find that on average last year, it took organizations 207 days to identify that they've been the victim of a breach. So right around 7 months. And that's insane. And it's largely because a lot of companies spend all of their time and resources on trying to prevent a cyber incident, and they don't have anything left over to identify and quickly respond to an incident. If you put all your eggs in that prevention basket, you're going to miss the ones that slip through the cracks, and it's going to take you potentially 7 months to identify that activity. And even then, it took companies on average 70 days after that to clean up after the fact. So we're talking like 9-10 months now from the point of infection to the point where you get the adversary off of your network. And during that time, they're not just going to sit there and do nothing. They're going to try and elevate their access across your organization. They'll phish your employees internally to gain additional credentials. They'll then use that access to phish your partners and your customers and the other folks that you work with in order to try and spread the breadth of their attack before they're detected, all while leading up to whatever their final coup de grace is, whether it be stealing all of the data out of your network or infecting all of your systems with ransomware, or more common than not these days, just doing both of those. And depending on what vertical you're in, the cost of one of these breaches really starts to add up, especially if you're in healthcare. So in healthcare, the average data breach costs over $10 million in the United States, and that's up from last year. In fact, the average cost for a breach is up almost across the board for every single vertical. And while this is the average across all sizes of organizations that reported into Verizon's data breach investigations report, you'll find that these costs are still quite substantial, even for small and mid-sized organizations too. Because everything from potentially paying the ransom if you make the determination to do that, to the cost of downtime, your lost productivity, the cost to bring in a incident response team to identify exactly how the adversaries got in, any regulatory issues if you're found out of compliance with any regulations you fall under, all these can add up to tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, even for a relatively small breach targeting a small or mid-sized organization. So I see a few questions that have popped in. One of them was, what is signature-based detections, please? So a signature-based detection is a anti-malware service, so think antivirus, another common name for it, that uses a signature, like a fingerprint, to identify whether a file is malicious or not. Maybe like ransomware all has a piece of its code that looks pretty similar. And if you can identify that piece of code, you can identify a lot of ransomware variants that way. So the upside of ransomware, of signature-based protection, is that it's really quick, does a really good job of quickly identifying stuff it knows. The downside is, though, that it misses things that it doesn't know. And so if you can hide your malware to make it look like a legitimate program, or if it's using new code patterns that signature authors haven't seen before, it can get past a lot of these basic detections. There was another question in here: what percentage do you see that is polymorphic? So to expand on that question, polymorphic code is basically a malware payload, a malware file that every single time it's downloaded or run, the code changes up a little bit to make it look different than other versions. And I don't have a percentage for specifically what subset of malware is polymorphic, but I'd say that is one of the many popular tools in the tool chest for adversaries to make their traditional malware get past these signature-based services. If you can make it change the code every time it runs, makes it really easy to get past some of these signature-based detections. But sometimes you don't even need to get that sophisticated. If you can just run it through a tool that makes it look similar enough to other programs that you can't block it without blocking those legitimate programs, that's often enough to get past signature-based protections. Good questions for those two, thank you. So let's pivot now, though, into the top 3 cyber threats that we need to watch out for just overall. And the first one is a big one that you've probably heard a lot. This encompasses everything from password theft to phishing attacks against our users, and that's account takeover. So account takeover and attacks related to that have been around for quite some time. In fact, we've seen executives start to realize how much we rely on a password to protect access to the entirety of our organization. And we've seen folks like Bill Gates, Google executives, Microsoft's current CEO, all attempting to kill passwords off entirely because of some of their security weaknesses. Unfortunately, those are going hand in hand with massive breaches across the entire world to the tune of tens of millions to even billions of passwords being lost. And once adversaries get their hands on these passwords, they can use them in attacks against our organizations. We're using them use techniques like password spraying, where they'll take the most common passwords and try them against an account. And you might think that, oh, I've got account lockout protections, where if someone tries 5 incorrect passwords, it'll lock them out from logging into that account. The adversaries are actually getting really good at getting around those protections by, instead of trying 1,000 passwords against one account, they'll try 1,000 accounts against one password. And by the time they've cycled through all of those accounts and moved on to the next password to go again, they're often outside of that window for a potential account lockout. We're also seeing them using credential stuffing attacks. This is where they take a breached set of known credentials. So they go and hack one website, steal the usernames and passwords, and then try those exact credentials against other tools. A really good example of this, I guess terrible example of it, was back in 2012. Now, you probably remember LinkedIn was the victim of a breach back then. They made off with, I think, 117 million usernames and passwords in that particular breach. Well, the hacker that broke into LinkedIn and stole that database, the first thing they did was they went through the list to look for any potentially high value or useful accounts. And one of the ones they found in there was tied to a Dropbox.com email address. So it was a Dropbox employee had signed up for LinkedIn and used their corporate email for their account. Unfortunately for that employee, their password for LinkedIn was really bad. And the attacker was able to crack that password relatively quickly after getting it out of the database. Unfortunately for Dropbox, that employee had reused that password for their LinkedIn account with their corporate Dropbox account. And so within weeks of hacking into LinkedIn, the same attacker was able to use this stolen credential to then breach Dropbox as well too. And this is just what happens when we don't use strong and unique passwords for each individual account we own, and especially what happens when we're not using multi-factor authentication. But even with MFA, attackers have other ways to potentially get into accounts. We see them using tools like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor, which is malware that runs on your system. It can steal passwords out of memory. It can steal other authentication material and launch past the hash attacks or golden ticket attacks against other assets on your network if they're able to first get onto that host. We've seen that not all multi-factor authentication is created equal. In fact, text-based or SMS-based MFA is one of the least secure implementations that you can possibly do. In fact, just ask Reddit's developers about that. A couple of years ago, Reddit suffered a breach where an attacker was able to first gain the valid usernames and passwords for a bunch of Reddit developers, and then they called up their mobile phone providers and convinced them to port over their phone numbers to a SIM card under the attacker's control, because it's really easy to call up that 18-year-old on the other end of Verizon and convince them to port over a phone number to something that you control. And that allowed them to intercept those SMS-based one-time passwords and then log right into the accounts. Now, other forms of MFA are significantly more secure. If you use ones that use a push notification on your phone, you get that little pop-up, you hit approve. Those use a encrypted communication channel to your phone itself. So stealing your phone number isn't even enough to gain access to that MFA token on its own. Unfortunately, attackers have actually gotten really good at just circumventing MFA entirely in some cases. You may have heard in the news recently this toolkit that went for sale on underground websites and on the dark web called Evil Proxy. And if you haven't heard about it, it's basically this commoditized service that you as a low-skilled attacker can rent out access to either for 10, 20, or 31 days, where it's custom tailored towards a specific service that you want to gain usernames and passwords and authenticated sessions to. So as an adversary, I might say, oh, I want to go target Office 365, and I want to get a bunch of people's usernames and passwords to O365. So I'll go pay a couple $100 to gain access to this tool for 2 weeks, and then I'll go deploy it. And when we look at the deployment architecture, it's actually, from a research perspective, pretty cool. So again, using that Office example, let's say I'm a bad guy and I want to try and phish people's Office 365 credentials. So my target website is office.com. I'll go license out Evil Proxy and set up my own server and register my own domain name, in this case, Office with just a few more F's in it, so that if you're someone like me and you're really busy during the day, you might not notice that instead of office.com, it's office.com, and you might fall for that phish in whatever email they send out. So now they create a phishing message. Maybe it's a fake file share or a fake voicemail or something, and they send it to a whole bunch of different victims. And then there is a link to the attacker's website, that Office with a few too many F's. When the user goes to connect that website, it's protected by encryption. They'll get a valid certificate. It's for the wrong domain, but it's still a valid certificate. So if you're, again, not paying close attention to your browser destination, you won't notice that it's going to this attacker website. The attacker then, on the other end of their phishing website, opens a separate connection to the real office.com. And so in the middle of these two encrypted connections, they're able to see and forward and proxy all of the requests that go back and forth. So when the victim loads up that website, they get a login form and they enter in their username and their password. Now, in a traditional phish, this is where it would end. The attacker would get the username and password. Because the destination is protected by multi-factor authentication and they don't have that victim's phone, yes, they've got their credentials, but they can't actually log in. With Evil Proxy, though, through their proxy website, they forward on those credentials to the legitimate website. That website then prompts the user for multi-factor authentication. Could be, say, hey, go check out your phone and hit accept. Could be the actual field where you have to enter in those 6 characters. Either way, the attacker forwards that back onto the victim. So to the victim, it looks like it's a legitimate authentication going on here. Putting your username and password, prompted for multi-factor authentication. If they put in their token or they accept that prompt, the attacker then forwards that onto the legitimate website too. And that legitimate website then successfully authenticates the user, at least what they think the user is, and sends back a session cookie. The reality is, it's the attacker in this situation that's authenticating with office.com, with all the victim's information, and they just successfully tricked that victim into accepting the MFA notification. So at this point, the attacker has the username, the password, and a working authentication cookie to access office.com. And even more terrible, they actually send that cookie back to the victim too in a lot of cases and redirect them to the legitimate office.com, so that now the victim, to their perspective, they don't see anything went wrong. They got a link, they clicked it, they logged in, and they are in the legitimate office.com at this point. But unfortunately, the attacker is also in there too. And by now, they've started accessing that victim's email. They probably have automated tools to go send out additional phishing messages to try and widen their net. And then they're going to try and use that access to potentially add another multi-factor token or authenticator to that victim's account so they can keep their access. And long story short, at this point, they've basically gained full access to that account and they're well on their way to going after the organization. The worst thing about this is Evil Proxy is fully commoditized for a very low fee. So it really lowers the bar for what used to be a very sophisticated attack. So now any low-skilled attacker can go set this up. They gain all the infrastructure from the authors of this. All they have to do is go register a website domain that looks something like their targets, and then craft a somewhat believable phishing message and send it to a bunch of now victims. So let's move on to number 2, though. See if any other questions popped in for that one. Oh, quite a few did. So will DNS Watch go to help prevent a breach using Evil Proxy? So for those that aren't aware, DNS Watch is WatchGuard's firewall, DNS firewalling service. We block connections at the domain request level by intercepting that DNS request and sending it to a sinkhole if it's something malicious, or the legitimate website if it checks out. To answer your question, will DNS Watch Go prevent a breach using Evil Proxy? The correct answer is yes. Because again, one of the key requirements for this style of attack is the attacker has to set up a malicious domain to host Evil Proxy. And so that malicious domain will identify it. It'll be included in our threat feeds for DNS Watch. We use a huge number of threat feeds that are regularly updated throughout the day. And we'll be able to block requests to that malicious domain and instead redirect victims to a safe, secure black hole where they're protected from that attack. Another one was, does multi-factor authentication protect against OAuth attacks? Let me wrap my head around this one for a second. So OAuth being a authentication protocol that allows you to log into a website. Multi-factor authentication will protect you against someone stealing your credentials. But if they're using a similar setup like this, where they're able to sit in the middle of this and there isn't any client validation going on, which 99% of the time there isn't, the attackers will be able to get into that OAuth session as well too. And again, gain that JSON web token or the session cookie or whatever authentication material the target website sends back. That's why this style of attack is so frightening, because all it takes is someone falling for a fish and not noticing that they're on a malicious website instead of a legitimate one. Also blocked because it's a new domain. Yeah, so the follow-up to the DNS Watch question was, would it also be blocked because it's new domain? That is correct. One of the factors that feeds into both DNS Watch and some of our other content filtering services is how recently the domain was registered. So if you are blocking newly registered domains, you would block access to this as well too. So another question was, should companies have policies against storing passwords in web browsers if malware can pull passwords out of memory? This is going to boil down to your own risk appetite within your company. The reality is password storage in web browsers is actually pretty secure, and you need a pretty significant malware infection on the host to be able to get them out. So the malware needs to have elevated privileges on the endpoint in order to gain passwords out of memory of that browser process. And I would argue that if you've already got malware on your endpoint that's got elevated access, you've got more problems than where you store your passwords. That said, if you use tools like a password manager or a password vault that have a little more protections, that can set you up for a little bit more success. But I don't necessarily at a policy level write off storing passwords in browsers, but I could see an argument for it. For time's sake, I'm going to keep chugging along. I do see some more questions in here regarding to regarding authentication attacks, and I will get to those at the end though. Number two though is fileless malware, and this is a bit of a technical one. So first off, let's differentiate this from traditional malware. So traditional malware is a malicious executable or binary, whatever you want to call it, that you get tricked into downloading onto your computer. It gets saved onto your storage device, so your hard drive or solid state drive or whatever, and then you have to execute it in order for the malware to run. And there's actually a lot of ways along that entire chain to detect and block this style of attack. Your traditional anti-malware on your endpoint is probably scanning everything you download. And so if it flags it as malicious, it can block it there. It's periodically rescanning files on your system to look for anything that might have slipped through. And again, it can flag it and delete it there. And if you delete that malware, that executable, and clean up any registry entries it touched and anything else really, you can theoretically get the system back to a safe and now uninfected state. With fileless malware though, it never actually saves anything to the storage on your device, which makes it significantly more difficult to detect and block. Instead, it injects its malware into the memory of another process on your computer. And now it's a bit of a misnomer. So it can and usually does actually start with a file, more often than not with a malicious Office document that's got macros or exploits a vulnerability if you haven't kept Office up to date in order to kick off a PowerShell. But once that PowerShell is running in memory, it can do everything else in memory entirely too. It can go out and download a ransomware payload. It can stage that and inject it into another process and then execute it there without ever saving something to your hard drive. And so if you're relying on protections that just scan for files, you're going to miss this entire category of attacks. The even more frightening kind doesn't start with a file at all. It just goes after a vulnerability in one of the applications you use. Like if you don't keep Firefox up to date and there's a remote code execution in Firefox or one of your plugins, and you get tricked into visiting a malicious website with an exploit kit, it can automatically fingerprint your browser, know that it's got this particular code execution vulnerability in it, exploit that, and then use that to run malicious shellcode, again, without ever saving anything onto your hard drive. And this style of attack's been around for quite some time. Like we've seen memory resident viruses dating back to the 80s. I think some of you have probably seen that's before I was born. We've seen fileless network worms in the 2000s. Code Red and SQL Slammer were pretty big ones. But these days, these living off the land attacks abusing PowerShell with toolkits like PowerSploit and PowerWare enable, again, even low-skilled attackers to carry off some of these pretty sophisticated attacks. And they've been having a lot of success too. They're using techniques like DLL and memory injection. So again, taking a legitimate process running on your computer and sticking something bad into it to allow it to evade a lot of our endpoint protections out there. We see them using legitimate Windows tools like PowerShell, NetSH, other programs, and they're often attached to a zero-day exploit of a program that you use on your endpoint. These really started to pick off in 2016, and again, I mentioned they're not always completely fileless. They do typically start with an Office document, but the difference is, as soon as you run that and allow that script to run, doesn't matter what you do with that Office document. The malware is already in memory. It's able to gain persistence in memory using some techniques with Windows Registry and basically saving a copy itself to the registry itself, where cleaning up that Word document isn't enough to clean up the entire infection. A really good example of this abuses something called dynamic data execution, or DDE. So for those that aren't big Windows or Office nerds, DDE is the protocol used to communicate between different Windows applications. A good example of this is if you take a Excel spreadsheet and copy and paste it into a Word document, you'll notice you can update the spreadsheet and it'll also update the Word document version. That's using DDE to facilitate that communication back and forth. But it's actually way more powerful than just that. You can use DDE to launch other applications. So you can load up Command Prompt and launch another executable. You could load up PowerShell with a encoded script to execute as it loads, which then that script go download a malware stager, which could then go download ransomware, and then again, use these toolkits to inject it into another process and execute. And the reason DDE attacks are becoming or are so successful is because they're really the next evolution of the macro malware that we used to see pretty commonly. But with a Office document, if you open it up and it's got macros in it, you'll notice that it's got that big yellow ribbon at the top that says warning, security alert. This has macros. Are you sure you want to enable it? And in fact, if you open up a macro laced document right now today, it probably won't allow you to even enable those macros thanks to a lot of protections Microsoft has just enacted in Windows. But to our users, they see that yellow ribbon that says security alert, and it tends to actually help them realize, okay, maybe I don't want to click enable. With DDE though, you don't get that. You get this little gray box that pops up that says, this document contains links that may refer to other files. Do you want to update this document with data from those linked files? And to an untrained user, if I see this, I go, oh, I guess we're just crapped out. So I don't know, yes. And that's enough to kick off DDE, allow it to execute whatever it wants. It'll go out and grab PowerSploit or some other toolkit and kick off a living off the land attack on that endpoint right then and there. And there's entire toolkits built around creating these malicious Office documents too. In Kali Linux, which is one of the really popular hacking, red teaming, penetration testing operating systems, there's a tool in there called Nishang that allows you to take a Office document as a template. So you could create one that says it's a shipping invoice as an example, and then run it through this toolkit with a malicious binary you want to execute or some form of malicious script, and it'll build this entire malicious Office document for you. It can use DDE to kick off the attack. It's got tools in there to disable PowerShell's anti-malware scan interface as well too. It's a really powerful toolkit, again, lowering the bar for anyone at all to carry out one of these attacks. So let me see. So see a couple of questions in here. There's a comment. Attackers can also downgrade Windows versions, correct? We see a lot, not even just Windows, we see a lot of attacks called bring your own library or bring your own executable attacks. There was a really popular one recently. I'm trying to remember if it was Kaseya or a different one. I think it might have been a Kaseya incident where it initially kicked off with them bringing their own copy of Microsoft Defender. So actual anti-malware software that was used in a malware attack. And the issue was this old version of Microsoft Defender was vulnerable to DLL injection, so library injection. Basically, when you run that program, it checks the directory that it's running out of for a few libraries it needs to use. And so if you bring that program over, the old Microsoft Defender, in a malicious library that's named after a legitimate one that the Defender needs, when it runs, it'll load in that malicious library and execute all of that bad code. But traditional endpoint protection will just see the fingerprint and even the hash of the legitimate Microsoft Defender application. And as you might imagine, a lot of protections will whitelist other anti-malware services. And so that could whitelist that malware running on that system. So yeah, really good point. For fileless malware, can we completely drain a system of power to remove it? Is it stored in NVRAM? So I'd say the typical fileless malware attack is not persistent. It'll run just in memory on the host. And so technically power cycling the host does clear out the infection. That said, they've actually gotten really good at gaining persistence while only being in memory while the system is running. One of the really popular ones is they'll actually save their stager into Windows Registry. So Windows Registry is memory based while it's running on the system. When you power it down, it'll get saved back to storage. When you load it back up, it gets loaded back into memory and it can execute out of there. So that's one of the more popular methods. That one is a little more easier to detect, but it can still give them persistence for a technically fileless malware attack. They've got other ways too, depending on their levels of sophistication. And I definitely wouldn't rely on just rebooting a system to clear out an infection, because that doesn't mean you necessarily got rid of whatever caused that infection, whether it be a file on the device that kicked it off or some other intrusion method or vulnerability that allowed them to get in. So let's see if there was anything. Would you work if you're also using an authenticator app? I think that was an authentication one. We'll grab that at the end of the presentation too. So let's go on to number 3 though. So speaking of vulnerabilities, software vulnerabilities is one of the biggest threats that you face as an organization. The reality is, like, software vulnerabilities are one of the easiest ways for an adversary to get into your network. Like you always hear people talk about hackers are lazy. The reality is hackers aren't lazy. They're actually pretty hardworking. Hate to admit it, but they are. The thing is, they like a good return on investment. And so if their investment is minimal because you've got a unpatched critical remote code execution vulnerability that you've exposed to the internet, makes you a really appealing target versus a organization that's got all of their walls and defenses up and kept their systems up to date. We've seen a lot of very big attacks and vulnerabilities over the past years. SQL Slammer that we mentioned earlier actually exploited a vulnerability that was found back in 2003. Same with the Conficker worm back in 2008. Those that have been in the industry a while probably remember Heartbleed when it broke just about every TLS enabled program under the sun. Eternal Blue was really big back in 2017. It allowed the WannaCry ransomware to become one of the most damaging ransomware variants ever. Bluekeep relatively recently too, impacting organizations that for some reason exposed RDP, remote desktop access to the internet. First off, never do that because you're relying on a 0-day vulnerability not existing in order to protect your organization. But that's a story for a different webinar. And then Log4Shell just a couple of months ago. I guess time sure does fly, back in December of last year. I don't know if any of you are in software engineering or software development organization, but Log4Shell was a nightmare to deal with from that perspective because you don't know what applications it's in, you don't know which tools you use are using this logging library, and it makes it really difficult to detect what your potential exposure is to something like Log4Shell. When it comes to going after vulnerabilities or the actual exposure surface for this, in the medical industry, man, we finally got rid of Windows XP, but we're seeing brand new medical devices right now today shipping with Windows 7. So brand new device shipping with an already end of life operating system. And that's pretty much par for the core in the medical space, unfortunately. We've got entire tools built around identifying potential vulnerable systems as well too. You've probably heard of Shodan. Census is another really popular tool that map the internet and register exactly what applications and servers are exposed to the internet. So an attacker can just get a license for one of these, go search for a vulnerability, find 20,000 potential targets, and nail them right then and there. And we're seeing more often than not proof of concept code or POCs popping up on GitHub, so on the clear web, within hours of a critical vulnerability being disclosed. So any attacker can go out there and use a tool like Shodan, find a bunch of targets, hop on GitHub, get the exploit code they need, and go and knock off a bunch of companies really quickly after one of these vulnerabilities pop up. And as defenders, it's actually really difficult for us to identify and prioritize which of our systems we need to patch. In fact, 72% of organizations, according to a recent poll, found that they are determined that they don't know how to prioritize what to go after. Do you patch the critical vulnerability, the 10 out of 10 CVSS score, or do you patch the high severity one that's got a known exploit out there? These are decisions that you have to make as an organization sometimes because the reality is we don't have resources typically to patch everything immediately. Most organizations actually delay their patches upwards of 12 days, depending on the severity. There were over 8,000 vulnerabilities registered in the National Vulnerability Database in Q1 of this year alone. That's an increase from all years prior because there's more researchers with eyes on it. People are realizing there's more that vulnerabilities are a really easy way to get into a company, and it's leading to even more of them being discovered. And on average, it took companies 58 days to patch the average vulnerability, which is honestly kind of surprising on the good side. Like I would have expected it to be significantly longer in all things considered. So it does mean that some companies are starting to enact good patch management schedules, potentially responding to the critical ones outside their normal patch window, but still too many are simply not doing it. If we go back to that Verizon data breach investigations report from this year, vulnerabilities in third-party software was one of the most common methods for a breach and also one of the more costly damages when used within a breach, only behind phishing and stolen or compromised credentials. Again, because if you can't just steal a username and password and walk right into the front door, going after a vulnerability that's exposed to the internet or on a client that client is browsing the internet with is the next best thing for an adversary. And I mentioned Log4Shell. So in the threat lab side, as soon as Log4Shell was disclosed, within hours, our honeynet lit up like a Christmas tree with attackers trying to exploit this vulnerability in any way possible. To give you a real quick high level with Log4Shell, it was basically if you could trick the website into running this tiny little bit of text through its logging program, so outputting activity logs on it or audit logs, it would exploit a vulnerability in the log4j logging library and gain code execution on that system. And as you might expect, many applications log web requests that come to it. So we saw attackers trying to go to, let's say, honeypot.com/the exploit code, or maybe they set all of the headers in the requests that exploit code, or maybe they set some of the request content to be that exploit code. It was actually really interesting sitting here in real time in the hours after that vulnerability disclosure, seeing all the different ways attackers were trying to scan the entirety of the internet and exploit exposed services with that vulnerability. Pause real quick, see if anything popped in. So this says Microsoft has continued to make changes to printing since the fallout of Print Nightmare, really damaging zero-day that could gain you elevated access on a Windows machine. How vulnerable are 7 to 10-year-old network connected printers on your network? So I think this is a bit of a two-parter. So Print Nightmare was an issue in the print spooling service on Microsoft Windows that could basically allow an attacker with network or physical access to that device to elevate their access to system level permissions. So let's say they had already gained access to your network, but it was through like your accountant's account or someone in your marketing team. So they didn't have full domain admin or even local admin on the system. If your Windows machine was vulnerable to this, they could use that to elevate to system, which opens up a whole nother avenue of attacks to, again, maybe run Mimikatz or Windows credential editor to steal credentials out and use that for even more attacks. So I'd say if you're keeping Windows up to date, you're pretty safe in that regard. I've seen printer spooler related vulnerabilities start to taper off, at least in discovery. Doesn't mean we found all of them, but we probably found at least the easy ones. Now, network connected printers, that goes into the realm of IoT or Internet of Things. And now you're relying on how robust the software that printer uses is. Is it, an off-the-shelf version of Linux that the printer manufacturer has just installed their own applications on? Or is it some custom on metal software, which is at least more common in residential printers running on there? I'd say when it comes to printers, though, especially 7 to 10-year-old ones, treat them like you would any other IoT device. And that means restrict access to just explicitly what is required for that thing to work, so specific ports and protocols on that system, and then monitor all of the access in and out of that system too. That way, if suddenly a printer starts beaconing home to Russia or China, you can raise some red flags and identify a potential intrusion on there, hopefully before it's able to carry off any attacks. Looks like a potentially follow-up question. Could you move your network printers into their own VLAN and with policies in WatchGuard to allow PCs to send print jobs, but not allow printers to send out to other VLANs? Yes, you absolutely can. So with our firewall appliance, or really, as much as I hate to say it, anyone in our space, you can set up rules and networked VLANs to isolate all of your, not just printers, but your IoT, and again, allow just the ports needed in there, and then block potentially all access from those devices entirely. Now, you might need to allow some outbound access from your printers to like the manufacturer's website to get updates, or maybe like a print server elsewhere on your network. But you can absolutely restrict access to any and all other destinations, both internally and externally, so that if that device does get infected, you limit its ability to spread. And that's really one of the hallmarks of zero trust networking that we're going to get into in just a second. So speaking of which, now that we've scared you all, and again, I'll get to the other questions here in just a second, let's stop and pivot and talk about how to defend our networks against these attacks. And if you take nothing else away from this webinar, I want you first to remember that it's not a matter of if, but when it comes to a cybersecurity incident. It's just like riding a motorcycle. There's only two types of motorcycles out there, motorcycle riders out there, those that have fallen and those that have not yet, but will. It's the same thing with cybersecurity. Like, you need to make sure that you've got strong defenses to both limit the opportunities for attack and limit the damages of an attack, but you also need to make sure you've got good detection and response tools to quickly identify ones that slip through the cracks and respond to them quickly. And when it comes to cybersecurity, there's no silver bullet. You can't install just one product or service and assume that you're completely unhackable, because that's simply not the case. So what can you do? Well, it starts with a layered defense. So making sure that you're covering your bases for all the different vectors that an attack can use to get into your network, whether it be a stolen credential, a phished employee, a unpatched vulnerability on one of your servers, or just someone walking in with a USB thumb drive and plugging it right in. These days, cyber attacks have many different ways to kick off the incident. So you need different layers depending on which method that attacker is using, so you've got all of your bases covered. And what does that mean at a high level? So first off, multi-factor authentication is key, not just for your privileged accounts, but for every single account within your organization. If it supports MFA, you should be using MFA. And again, like we talked earlier, that alone isn't perfect. There are tools like Evil Proxy that with a little bit of social engineering can help get past some multi-factor authentication based protections, but it significantly lowers the or increases the barrier and the bar that attackers have to get over in order to execute an authentication attack. It protects you against stolen credentials, not necessarily against sophisticated phishing attacks. For that, you want to make sure you've got other technical controls to back you up too. So layers of advanced anti-malware. So not signature-based or not just signature-based, because again, that does a good job of quickly in identifying known threats, but you want to make sure you've got proactive anti-malware too. Things that use machine learning to predict whether a payload is good or bad. Or even better, a safe, secure sandbox, like a cloud-based sandbox, to actually detonate that file, watch its behaviors, and then based off the behaviors, determine whether it's good or bad. You want to make sure you've got phishing protection for your users and phishing awareness training so they know how to spot some of these phishing messages that come through. And again, you're never going to get your click rate down to 0. That's not the goal. The goal is to get your click rate down low enough that your other controls can pick up the slack and stop the attacks for the folks that do end up falling for a phish. Make sure that you've got strong endpoint protection, and not just endpoint protection, but also endpoint detection and response, so EDR tools. What differentiates that from traditional endpoint protection is EDR is looking at the existing processes on your computer, the memory of those processes, and the behaviors of applications as they start up, execute, and continue to run to just raise red flags for any suspicious activity. And more often than not, if you identify enough red flags, you can stop a attack right there in its tracks. An example of this is if you suddenly see calculator.exe spinning up Windows encryption libraries and enumerating your entire file system, that's enough red flags that something has injected ransomware into Calculator and it's going to start encrypting all of your system files. And then again, back all this up with a proactive driven, procedure driven patch management system. So make sure that at a minimum, you've got a schedule for patching all of your systems, and then procedures for quickly patching any critical vulnerabilities on your most critical or at least network exposed systems too. Make sure you've also got all this backed up by a strong incident response and disaster recovery plan. So do you have a plan in place before the incident happens? That'll help out tremendously so you're not trying to figure this out in the moment, which is potentially one of the worst moments of your professional lives responding to something like this. Good hallmarks of a BCDR plan. Make sure you've got legal counsel on staff or retainer, especially if you're in a regulated industry. You don't want to be trying to navigate regulations and reporting requirements in the moment. You want to know what you need to do beforehand. Make sure you've got incident response either on staff or retainer, so that you can have someone come in that's an expert in investigating a cyber incident to figure out not just what happened, but how did they get in, so you can make sure that that hole is patched before you bring everything else back online. Make sure that, hopefully all of you already know you need to back up all of your data. Hopefully you know that you need to test that restoration of the data, but make sure you do that regularly with tabletop exercises. Because again, your backups are only as good as your ability to restore from them in the event of an incident. When it comes to your backup policies, make sure you've got a system that follows the 3-2-2 model. So 3 different types of data in 2 different locations. One of them being preferably somewhere outside of the, let's say, the blast radius of Mount Rainier exploding in Seattle, if that's where your office is at, somewhere fully off-site so you can recover in the event of an incident that's geographically located as well too. And then finally, make sure you adopt a zero trust approach to security. I give Gartner a lot of crap for their buzzwords that they come up with, but zero trust is one of the best buzzwords that they've ever come up with because it really explains this topic that us as security professionals have been preaching for decades. And that's the principle of least privileged, making sure that users and systems only have access to just what they need and nothing else more. That's exactly what zero trust is. And it starts by identifying those users and systems accurately. So you can know that, is this Mark logging in from his corporate machine in Seattle? Or is this maybe Mark logging in from some laptop we've never seen in Russia? And being able to allow or deny activity based off of that strong identity of that user trying to connect in. It also means setting up your networks with a deny by default approach, a deny by default architecture, so that by default, you don't have access to anything. But once we've confirmed exactly who you are and what you're connecting with, we'll give you access just to what you need and nothing else more. There's no reason that my accountants need access to my source code repository. And yes, that source code is protected by authentication, even MFA. But even network-based access is still too risky because then you're just hoping that there isn't an unknown vulnerability on that system that could allow an attacker that's compromised one of those accountant accounts to access that source code repository. And then also make sure you continuously monitor activity on your network. So assume that there is a breach somewhere and try and find it. That way, if there is an incident, you can quickly identify it and not become one of those folks that, 7 months after the fact is just realizing that there's been a cybersecurity breach. So I will go ahead and pivot to questions now. My Twitter and LinkedIn and email are always open to any other questions you have after the fact too. So are you talking about setting up ACLs, access control lists, like you would on a switching router or a VLAN? I think this is in regards to the printer question earlier, or just in basic zero trust architecting. So one of the hallmarks of both zero trust and protecting IoT devices is network segmentation. And that doesn't just mean throw them on two different VLANs that can fully route between each other. It means controlling the access between those VLAN networks. So like, let's say I've got a print server and it's at 192.168.1.10. Let's say they connect to it over port 5000. That means when I set up that new network and that device and my other networks, only allowing port 5000 to that specific IP address on that network and nothing else. So that if there's a malware infection trying to connect like the management port of that printer, it can't get there from any other network. And if there's an infection on that printer itself, it can't get anywhere else because all of that is blocked by an ACL2. And that is the baseline for a zero trust approach to networking. And that's honestly something you can probably do right now with the tools you already have without buying any zero trust enabling service at all. Like at a minimum, you can start segmenting your networks, setting up deny by default, and using authenticated access to allow access to just systems and services that any particular source really needs. Is there a WatchGuard solution to screen out messages using display name spoofing? So my assumption with this one is regarding email potentially, since that's one of the more common avenues for spoofing a display name for like a source of an email address. Could also potentially be a phishing website itself. Short answer to this is, with WatchGuard, we've got Spam Blocker, which does a really good job of identifying potential spam or phishing messages, and it can block them if it's in line with your networking service. Now, most organizations these days probably don't have a Exchange server locally on their network anymore. You're probably using Office 365 for that now instead, or some form of hosted email. And so that might not be the correct service for that one. But we do have other ones like DNS Watch that can help protect against someone clicking on one of those potential links. It basically neuters the email entirely of all malicious content, so that even if you do somehow receive it and you do fall for that phish and click the link, instead of going to the malicious website, you'll go to a safe and secure black hole instead. How prevalent are attacks on nonprofit organizations? So this is actually a good question just on the whole of it. And I'd expand it to say, like, how prevalent are attacks against like my organization if you're a small business, or my organization if you're a mid-sized one? It used to be like we'd say, you probably don't have to worry about North Korea hacking into your company or even other state-sponsored hacking organizations. But the reality is these days, there's no such thing as someone too small to be a target for even state-sponsored actors. Now, we're finding state-sponsored and cybercriminal actors even love going after smaller organizations, if only to add them into a botnet to then use to go after bigger companies too. And the reality is, like, you wouldn't be in business if you didn't have something valuable. So for those in the for-profit sector, it's whatever product or service that you offer. For the nonprofit sector, maybe it's just the connections that you have with other organizations. You have something of value that's the reason for your existence. And because it's a value, attackers know that if they can block your access to that or steal it from you, they might be able to convince you into paying up to regain access or to delete that from their systems. And smaller organizations are even more targeted than this because they more often than not haven't set up their defenses correctly in order to protect against some of these sophisticated attacks. I'd say if you are a smaller business or a smaller nonprofit and you don't have a dedicated security team or potentially even an IT team, make sure you pair up with a service provider, a MSP or an MSSP, in order to give you some guidance and some resources to protect your network in a way more cost-effective way than you could do it on your own potentially. So what is a proposed alternative to a password these days that orgs are suggesting? With Microsoft, so you can actually delete your password from your Microsoft account right now if you want. The downside is, like, that sounds really cool, but the downside is they're just replacing it with another single factor, and some of them are even worse than a password. One of the factors that you can replace your password with for a Microsoft account is a link they send to your email anytime you want to log in. And the reason I say that's worse than a password is, at least with a password, it's probably different, hopefully different than your email password. So compromising your email isn't necessarily enough to compromise your Microsoft account. Now, obviously, they could reset your password, but by then, you're going to see these password reset notifications go back and forth, and you'll probably at least hop on it and realize, oh, someone's compromised my account. With replacing it with another single factor, like a link in the email, if they get your email, they can log right in just by clicking that link, and that's it. So one of the things I'll say is, when it comes to replacing a password or removing a password, replacing it with another single factor is not good enough. Replacing it with two other factors and still using MFA, even if one of those multiple factors isn't a password, is significantly more secure than any one single factor alone. And so if you've got a Microsoft account and you choose to go delete your password, make sure you've got another one, at least two factors to back it up then too. Would this work if you're using an authenticator attack? I'm assuming this is the evil proxy walkthrough I did. That would still work with an authenticator and attack, because the attacker will proxy on that little box that you need to enter in the token for. You'd type in your 6 little numbers and it'll send it back to the server. If it's the push notification version of an app, they will prompt you to accept the notification. The attacker will proxy on that prompt. You'll pull up your phone, hit approve, and that'll allow it all to succeed right then and there. So we are up on time. I think there might be one or two that I didn't get in here. I will try and maybe reach out to you over email. Again, if you want to contact me with any questions you have, please do. So thank you again for hopping on. Hope to chat with you again sometime soon. Otherwise, see you around.